Hey everybody, welcome to the special Sunday edition of the show. Today I want to follow up on apparently this new species of human that's been found in the Philippines. And I did a video on this a few months ago, but at the time it wasn't declared a new human species. They just called him the Callao Man. And I talked about the Callao Man found in Callao Cave. I also talked about the other guy, the Tomban Man or something like that. It starts with a T. I just can't remember right now. But there are two species. There are two ancient humans found in the Philippines at the time, and I was talking about it, and also was talking about the different hypotheses they had. Well, now they classified officially the Callao Man is indeed what they're now calling Homo Luzonensis, which is named after the island of Luzon that it's in. And just to give you guys a visual, these are the Philippines here, and the very northern part of the island in this mountainous region here is the cave. Now, in my previous video, there was a lot of speculation that the Eta people, who are these indigenous people who live in the mountains, spread all across the Philippines here. This is what they look like. These people were thought to have had some sort of connection to Homo Luzonensis, this new human, and that is just one of the hypotheses that they have about these people. But there's a lot of speculation going on, and there's a lot of scenarios being put forth that I want to help elucidate with this video, because they can get really confusing and really, really convoluted if you aren't reading and keeping up with everything. So this article is from the New York Times, or by way of MSN, and then there's other articles too. CNN came out with one. Pretty much every outlet has come up with one, and they're all pretty much saying the same thing of what happened. So what happened was around the year 2000 or so. Back then, he's now a doctor now, but at the time he was a grad student. He was looking through the caves, and he found a bunch of different bones of animals and a bunch of different things in there. But he didn't find anything of note, but he kept it in mind, because at the time, Homo floresiensis, which is the hobbit person that they found, it was making the news a little bit later on. So in 2007, 7 years later, he decided to revisit the cave, and he found a bunch of bones. First he found I think it was a finger bone, and then he had help with other scientists came in and helped him out, and they found like a femur, a hand bone, teeth, and I have photos of it here. So this is the toe bone, and you can see it's really small and it's curved, and that the curvature on these bones are going to be very important later on. And these are 3D images of these bones, these scans. So you have the toe bones here, finger bones. I think this is a femur, and then these are the teeth. And the teeth are what really made the scientists classify them as a human, as their own branch of the human family tree, so to speak. And they are dated to 50,000 years ago. And floresiensis also has a very similar date. I think they're about 60,000 years. But either way, because of this, it's got everybody buzzing, because instead of this straightforward linear march, as they call it, of our human origins, it's more like a burst and a bunch of different branches that are going on along the way as we travel through time. So about 100,000 years ago, we're discovering all these different humans and these hybrids. So for example, in China, they think they found the toe bone it's called the Tongzi bone or something, the Tongzi Man. And they think he's a mix of Homo erectus and Denisovans. So they're finding all these, not mutants, but these hybrids, so to speak. And the discussion has come full circle. They're like, well, maybe they're all just some variation of Homo erectus. And Homo erectus is probably the oldest and the most reoccurring fossil of a hominin outside of Africa. for a long stretch of time. So 1.8 million years ago, they left Africa. There's evidence that they left Africa. And now we're finding that they spread to Southeast Asia as well as China and even Australia. And Homo sapiens, in contrast, from what we know, we came from Africa, and then we went to the Middle East, and then over Siberia and into Australia, about between 100,000 years ago to 60, 50, 40,000 years ago, depending on who you ask. As you can see, it's really convoluted. So where did these hobbit people come from? Maybe they're Homo erectus, because they did find Homo erectus in the Philippines as well. So as logic would conclude, maybe these are just an offshoot of Homo erectus. The problem is, and there's a few, if these hobbit people did branch off from Homo erectus, how long does it take for them to shrink? Because they're considerably smaller than Homo erectus themselves. They have smaller across the board, smaller brains. They're barely 3 feet tall. You guys saw the bones; they're tiny. That one that we saw were like 2 centimeters. There's obviously something up, and now there's a debate going on. So what I told you, that these are just shrunken versions of Homo erectus, that's one hypothesis. And you guys decide if that makes sense to you. I don't know. I just think it's very risky to try to make any call. But it is good to have speculation. Healthy speculation is not bad. It weeds out good ideas from the bad ideas. So Matthew Tocheri, he's a paleoanthropologist involved, or he wasn't involved in the discovery, but he's an authority in the field. He says the more we gather information, the more we realize that the variation that was present in the past far exceeds what we see in us today. So what he's saying is, and he's kind of stating the obvious here, today we just see Homo sapiens and that's it. And that's because from what we know so far, we're the last ones of this our Homo species. That must mean, like, and I'm not even talking about Younger Dryas or even the eruption of Mount Toba, which was a planet killer. It almost wiped us out, which was about 72,000 years ago. Some hominins survived. I mean, because these guys were living there at the very least 50,000 years ago, which is 20,000 years or so after Mount Toba. So let's go to Homo floresiensis for a second. So the first thing I thought I heard about this new species was, maybe they're just a variation of floresiensis. Whoever their common ancestor was, whether it was Homo erectus or not, perhaps they went into all the islands and they just spread from there. Let me get that visual right here. So yeah, so you see Luzon up here and then Flores is down here. So, I mean, that is a big distance, but it seems like they had ample time to get up there, right? Well, the problem with that is their anatomies are different. So Homo floresiensis, when they looked at the remains, they closely resemble other hominins like modern humans. So Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. They were able to make stone tools, and although they did have tiny brains and they were shorter, they seemed that their capacity for abstract thought and tool usage, at the very least, existed. Now that we separated the two, that kind of paints a weird scenario. Go back to that photo. So at the time, the sea levels were a lot lower. So all this is called Sundaland. This would have been a subcontinent or a supercontinent. Not a supercontinent, but it would all have been one landmass. The Philippines, though, this part of the Philippines, it was never connected to the mainland. It was never connected to Sundaland. So it was always somewhat isolated from land masses. So what they had to say, so part of the hypothesis is they had gotten there either through swimming, which is very unlikely, or rafting. And they think that it was either Homo erectus or some other as yet named hominin that got there. So that's why they think Homo erectus, once they landed there, they shrunk because it's an island, different biodiversity, different nutrition, smaller surface area. That all leads to island dwarfism, that phenomenon. That's what one of the theories. On this thread of Homo erectus, let's trace back the origins. So just to paint a better picture. So the oldest fossils of any hominin dates back over 6 million years, and they've all been found in Africa. So like Lucy's about 3.5 million years, which is an Australopithecus. And they started out, they were short, small-brained bipedal apes. Sounds familiar, right? That sounds like floresiensis. That sounds like Luzonensis. And then 2.5 million years ago, one lineage of African hominins began to evolve new traits. So they start to look more modern human-like. Flatter face, bigger brains. They're bigger in stature. They're starting to have larger and larger populations. Savannas started coming, and so there's more open space, and they're coming out of they're not being shy about coming out of the trees, according to this academic, I guess the accepted theory right now. And then these people were known as Homo habilis, or the first known members of our genus. So not modern humans like Homo sapiens, but the precursors, an ancient precursor. And then 1.8 million years ago, Homo erectus started to appear outside of Africa. And this is where the out of Africa theory gets its legs. Homo erectus spread east. Homo erectus, about 1.8 million years ago, they go from Africa and they go east. They go to China and they go to Southeast Asia. Now, did they go there on foot or did they take a raft there? We don't know, because logically you would think that we would find a trail of fossils belonging to these hominins that would, track where they went. We haven't found anything like that for this new hominin. Homo erectus they found everywhere. So Homo erectus, they reach Indonesia 143,000 years ago, the youngest Homo erectus fossils. So if they get there around, let's say 200,000 years ago, between 150 200,000 years ago, is 100,000 years, give or take, enough time to morph? That's one of the key questions here. And that's one of the things you guys should think about if you're following this. The hypothesis already told you Homo floresiensis evolved from Homo erectus. Could hominins have reached Luzon as well as Flores? And so they went back and they checked it out. By the way, his name is Dr. Mijares. He's a guy who was a grad student who's now a doctor who discovered everything in Luzon Cave. All the discoveries happened under his watch. So he's the authority there, one of the authorities of this study. So they found the foot bone, the teeth, and they all dated them to 50,000 years ago. And then the fossils came from 3 individuals. So that's very interesting as well. That means we have 3 different people to base some of this evidence on. So that's better than 1. That's actually, it doesn't sound like much, but that's actually very, very important when we're talking about this. The teeth had very peculiar shape. The front teeth had 3 roots, for example, whereas those of our species usually only have just 1, and the teeth were tiny. So because of that, because the front teeth have 3 roots, that's a very, very primitive human trait that we no longer have. So because of that, in addition to their curved toes and their curved fingers, they think that these guys weren't an offshoot of Homo erectus, but rather they were probably an offshoot of an even earlier human, and they think it's Australopithecus. So here we have a visual of the teeth. This is Luzonensis here, and then this is Floresiensis, Sapiens, Erectus, and Neanderthalis. So this bottom row are pretty similar to each other because they're all single root. Luzonensis is a more typical tooth, and that is such a head scratcher, because if that's the case, that means Luzonensis is a distant cousin rather than a closer ancestor, a closer family member, so to speak. So that means, and sometime in the remote past, Australopithecus, which is 3 million, give or take, years old, they must have somehow found their way across either the ocean or on foot out of Africa all the way to the Philippines. That must have happened. And how could that be? Australopithecus couldn't have those faculties. They couldn't. Could they? Could they have boated over there? because that place is not accessible on foot. You've got to get on the island over the water or flying, which I doubt they had flight. So that's got to be out of the equation. So again, this is another conundrum we need to think about. This is Debbie Argue, paleoanthropologist who is also not involved in the study but following it closely. These adult teeth are smaller than any hominin known. Could it be that these teeth belong to adults that were even smaller than Homo floresiensis? The thing is about Luzonensis is they have this strange mix of traits. So, like I said earlier, the toe bone looks nearly identical to those living 3 million years ago, and this is a visual here. So these are the toe bones. Do you see how curved they are? This is Australopithecus, again 3 million years old, and then this is Luzonensis right here. The similarities are uncanny. And then, just as a reference, this is ours, Homo sapiens, and it's much, much straighter. Partially or mainly to do with our lifestyle. We're although they were bipedal, we don't live in the trees. We walk on the ground and we live on the ground. And our anatomy reflects that. So this right here, along with the teeth, make it a very, very interesting case. And which is probably why they decided to give it its own classification as its own species. So that was one of the biggest surprises for me. Was it's not directly related to floresiensis. Floresiensis, maybe they did descend from Homo erectus, but the evidence is the biological and the biomechanical evidence is pretty clear that they were different. They were different populations. So that must mean that they came in at different times or different waves, different stages of Earth's history. Very, very interesting stuff. The combination of features is like nothing we have seen before. They've concluded the evidence pointing to new species. Drawing such a conclusion from a few bones is risky, though. I agree. But all we can do is just search for more and more and build this repository of fossils. Then we can zero in on what's what, essentially. Homo erectus may have been the ancestor of the tiny hominins on both Flores and Luzon, perhaps swept by the island by storms, clinging to trees. It may even be possible that Homo luzonensis descended from hominins that came to Luzon hundreds of thousands of years earlier, which I think makes the most sense. I don't think they came from erectus. Just because I just don't think it's enough time. And also, why would they revert back? So, Homo erectus, their digits are a lot like ours. But if you saw the picture here. If Luzonensis, let's say 200,000, let's say 500,000 years earlier, erectus came in, and they have these straight digits. It wouldn't make sense that they would not only succumb to island dwarfism, but their bones would go back. It would revert back to Australopithecus. I guess, like, where else in nature does that happen? The only thing that I can think of, which isn't even a good example because I don't think it changes the shape of their bones, but when you get a domesticated pig or a domesticated horse and put them in the wild, they get different phenotypes. So with the pig, they get their skin color changes, they get thicker skin, they get tusks, and they get hair. Like something triggers in their genes to change. Same with wild horses. When you get a domesticated horse and put them in the wild, they start getting zebra stripes. Not to the extent like of a black and white zebra, but there's a discoloration in their fur or their hair that indicates stripes. So those mechanisms are very interesting. They've baffled scientists for a long time. But is it possible to change their bone composition, their bone structure? I don't know. I don't think that makes any sense because I haven't seen anything replicate that in nature. And then and there's a different cave on Luzon, the same island. They found stone tools dating back 700,000 years. So these that means some type of hominin were occupying the space at the almost for a million years concurrently. So there were hominins on Luzon 700,000 years ago and 50,000 years ago. So did they belong to the same population? One of the archaeologists, who is also the co-author of the study, he thinks it's likely the same lineage, just because to him that's logical. Over the next several 100,000 years, he speculated Homo erectus shrank as it adapted to life on Luzon. But then Dr. Teixeira doesn't buy into the island dwarfed version of Homo erectus, and he thinks perhaps small hominins in Africa expanded into Asia all way before this, millions of years before this, and wound up on Flores and Luzon somehow, because they were trying to take refuge from bigger hominins who may be predators to them, which is very interesting. If we're finding these things over there's got to be a record of them all the way across the continent leading back to Africa. That's what I said. So the next thing they got to do is, and this is going to be a big task, is to try to retrace all the possible steps, all the potential steps along this map, and just dig and try to find scout out these sites where they would likely find these small hominins, these Luzonensis or floresiensis bones. And that's going to take a long time unless they find a really good lead. So I guess what I'm trying to say is it's going to be I think it might be a while before we really get to the bottom of this. But it's very, very interesting, to say the least. So before I stop this video, it seems to me that the picture is not this linear progression from proto-humans 6 million years ago, proto-hominins, to us, but rather it seems like people, whether they're part of our genus Homo or a precursor to that, it seems like they were in spots already, that they were dotted all over. So if I had a time machine and went back 100,000 years, 200,000 years, 500,000 years, the world must have looked like some type of video game where there's a bunch of different races, like World of Warcraft or something. Like we have these giant people here, we have these small dwarf people here, we have elf people here, we have people who look like modern humans here, we have hairy people over there, we have people who look more like apes over here, but they're bipedal. It seems like that's where it's pointing to. And then when you read certain scripture, like Goliath was a giant, or when you hear about the legend of Sasquatch in the Native American tradition, these giant people, even the giant skulls in museums that are just sitting there with the red hair, and they're 8 to 9 feet tall. Some were 10 feet tall, and then they fought a great war with the Native Americans, and they died. Or even the Nephilim, and then you hear all this lore about a previous order of beings who get supplanted by the new order of beings, and maybe they were spot on. And I just read an article this morning about these cave paintings in the Balkans that date to 34,000 years ago. And they have these anthropomorphic figures, and we see anthropomorphic figures everywhere. So is it just figurative? Is it just a metaphor? Or were there really like centaur-like people out there? No, we don't know now. And because of this new discovery of this second version of the Hobbit people, you can almost say all bets are off now. No one can say either way whether that's BS or whether that's factually true. And it seems like that some version of that may be true. So let me know what you guys think in the comments. I think this is very, very fascinating stuff. Callao Cave and that part of the Philippines should be turned upside down, and we should try to find all kinds of stuff that we can in those caves, in these mountains here. it just seems logical that we should just keep looking. And Indonesia seems like a really, really rich area. The only issue is that it's humid, so it's hard to extract DNA off of that stuff. So anyway, here's the hoping that we get closer to the truth, and I'll talk to you guys later.